The room was dimly lit, the heavy scent of antiseptic mingling with the faint aroma of lilies placed on the bedside table. Thomas Whitaker, a man once full of life and laughter, lay still in his hospital bed, his breaths shallow and labored. At 73, the years of hard work, family love, and quiet sacrifices had caught up with him, and now he was at the final chapter of his life. Yet, amidst the somber atmosphere, one figure remained unwavering. Baxter, Thomas's loyal golden retriever, lay curled at the foot of the bed, his amber eyes glistening with an expression that could only be described as heartbreakingly human. At 12 years old, Baxter had been Thomas's constant companion, sharing both the quiet mornings on the porch and the tumultuous nights of loneliness that sometimes plagued the aging man. Today, however, Baxter's usual warmth and vitality were replaced by a strange unease. The nurses whispered about the unusual devotion of the dog. "He hasn't left the room for 3 days," one murmured. Another added, "He even skips his meals. It's as if he knows." Their voices trailed off, hesitant to complete the sentence. Thomas's daughter, Emily, sat by the bedside, her fingers lightly brushing her father's frail hand. She glanced at Baxter with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "He's always been like this," she whispered to a nurse. "But lately, it feels like he's trying to tell us something." The silence was broken only by the faint beeping of the heart monitor and the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside. Emily thought back to the countless memories Baxter and her father had shared, how the dog would nudge Thomas's hand for treats or sit patiently by his feet during his evening prayers. And now, as Thomas drifted closer to the end, Baxter seemed more determined than ever to stay by his side. What no one could have known was the secret Baxter held, a truth he couldn't articulate, but that drove his steadfast loyalty. As the minutes ticked by and the room grew quieter, the story of their bond and the heartbreaking revelation it would bring was about to unfold. The quiet hum of the hospital room was interrupted only by the rhythmic beeping of the machines. Emily, unable to shake the sense of urgency in Baxter's behavior, leaned forward, gently stroking the dog's head. His fur, now streaked with silver, was warm under her hand, but his eyes betrayed a deep restlessness. It was as if Baxter carried a message, one that weighed heavily on his loyal heart. Baxter's devotion to Thomas had always been extraordinary. From the day Thomas brought him home as a rambunctious puppy, their bond had been unshakable. When Thomas retired from his job as a schoolteacher, it was Baxter who brought new joy and purpose into his life. Together, they created routines, morning walks through the park, afternoons reading on the porch, and quiet evenings by the fireplace. Thomas often joked, "Baxter knows me better than anyone, even you, Emily." But the past year had been different. Thomas had begun to slow down, his health deteriorating faster than anyone expected. What started as fatigue soon turned into unexplained weight loss and persistent coughing. Baxter seemed to sense it before anyone else, often refusing to leave Thomas's side. At first, Emily thought it was just the dog's natural loyalty. But now, watching him curled protectively on the hospital floor, she felt there was something deeper at play. "Dad," Emily said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "do you see how Baxter hasn't left you? He's always been like this, hasn't he?" Thomas's eyes fluttered open, his gaze weak but filled with warmth as he looked at his daughter. "He's a good boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Always has been. But there's something about today, Em. I think he knows." Emily's chest tightened at her father's words. "Knows what, Dad?" she asked, leaning closer. But Thomas didn't answer. His eyes drifted shut again, his energy too faint to continue. Emily glanced down at Baxter, whose gaze remained fixed on Thomas, his body tense as though he were on guard duty. She couldn't shake the feeling that the dog was trying to tell her something. Later that afternoon, the doctor entered, his expression kind but professional. "Emily, can I have a word with you?" he asked, motioning for her to step outside. Reluctantly, she followed, casting a worried glance back at her father and Baxter. In the hallway, the doctor explained that Thomas's condition was worsening. "He may only have a few days left," he said gently. "We'll do everything we can to keep him comfortable, but it's important to prepare yourselves." Emily nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you, doctor," she managed, her voice strained. As she turned to go back inside, she paused and suddenly overcome by a thought. "Can you tell me, or do you think Baxter being here is helping him?" she asked, her voice almost pleading. The doctor smiled faintly. Animals have a way of providing comfort that even medicine can't explain. If Baxter's presence gives your father peace, then I'd say it's more than helping. Returning to the room, Emily found Baxter still at his post. She knelt beside him, her fingers running through his fur. "You're amazing, you know that," she whispered. Baxter looked up at her, his amber eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name, an emotion too profound for words. As night fell, the hospital room grew quiet. Emily had insisted on staying overnight, pulling a chair close to Thomas's bed. Baxter remained vigilant, barely shifting from his spot, his ears twitching at every sound. At one point, Emily dozed off, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. It was a soft whine from Baxter that woke her. The dog had risen to his feet, his body trembling slightly. He placed his head gently on Thomas's arm, letting out another low, mournful sound. Emily's heart clenched at the sight. She reached out to stroke his back, murmuring, "It's okay, boy, I'm here too." But as she touched him, something peculiar happened. Baxter nudged a small leather pouch that had been lying on the bedside table. The motion was deliberate, as though he wanted her to notice it. Emily frowned, picking up the pouch. "What is this, Dad?" she whispered, though she knew her father was too weak to answer. Opening the pouch, she found a collection of old photographs, most of them of Thomas and Baxter during their adventures together. One picture, however, caught her attention. It was of Thomas holding Baxter as a puppy, his expression filled with an emotion that went beyond mere affection. On the back of the photograph, in Thomas's neat handwriting, were the words, "For Baxter, my guardian, my gift." Emily's hands shook as she read the words. "Guardian," she murmured aloud. She looked at Baxter, who was watching her intently, his eyes never leaving hers. It was as if he was waiting for her to understand something. What could her father mean by calling Baxter a guardian? And why did the dog seem so desperate to stay with him now? At this moment, as the hours ticked by, Emily found herself unable to let go of the strange sense of urgency. There was something unspoken, a truth lingering in the air, waiting to be uncovered. Baxter's unwavering presence felt like a key, but to what she didn't yet know. The dim glow of the hospital lights cast long shadows across the room. Emily sat in the chair by Thomas's bedside, the small leather pouch still in her hands. She studied the photographs carefully, flipping through them one by one. Each image told a story. Afternoons at the lake, hiking through golden autumn forests, lazy evenings by the fireplace. But the last photo was different. It wasn't of Thomas and Baxter. Instead, it showed a young Thomas standing next to a golden retriever, its fur a striking match to Baxter's. The dog had the same intense gaze, the same alert posture. On the back, the name Rusty was scrawled in faded ink. "Rusty," Emily whispered, confused. She looked down at Baxter, who was once again lying by Thomas's side, his nose resting against the man's frail arm. The resemblance between Baxter and the dog in the photo was uncanny, almost eerie. Was it possible? No, it couldn't be. Rusty must have been Thomas's childhood dog. But then why had her father kept this photograph hidden away? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement from Thomas. His eyes fluttered open, and he turned his head weakly toward her. "Emily," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "Dad, I'm here," she said quickly, leaning closer. "What is it?" Thomas's gaze shifted to Baxter, a faint smile forming on his lips. He came back," he whispered, his words barely a breath. Emily frowned, confused. "What do you mean, Dad?" "Who came back?" Thomas's hand trembled as he reached for the photograph in her hands. "Rusty," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I never thought, but he came back as Baxter. He's always been my guardian." Emily's heart raced as her father's words sank in. "Dad, you're not making sense. Baxter he's just a dog." But Thomas shook his head weakly. "Not just a dog," he insisted. "He's been with me before. He's here for a reason." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. Could her father truly believe that Baxter was the reincarnation of his childhood dog? The idea seemed impossible, fantastical even. And yet, as she looked at Baxter, she couldn't deny that the dog's behavior, his devotion, his uncanny timing, was unlike anything she'd ever seen before. Thomas's eyes drifted shut again, his energy fading. "Take care of him," he murmured. "He'll take care of you." Emily sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. She glanced at Baxter, who had lifted his head slightly, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. It was as if he understood every word Thomas had said. The following morning, Emily decided to dig deeper. She left the hospital briefly to visit her father's house, hoping to find some answers among his belongings. The house, filled with memories of her childhood, felt eerily silent. In her father's study, she found a stack of old journals tucked away in a drawer. She flipped through them, searching for any mention of Rusty or Baxter. One entry caught her attention, dated nearly a year before Baxter came into Thomas's life. It read, March 14, 2009. "I dreamt of Rusty again last night. It's been decades since he passed, but the dream felt so real. He was standing by my side, just as he always did. I woke up with this strange feeling, as if he's not truly gone. Maybe it's just wishful thinking, but it's comforting to believe he's still looking out for me." Emily's breath caught as she read the words. Her father had dreamed of Rusty before he adopted Baxter. Could it be possible that he had somehow known Baxter would come into his life? She continued searching, finding more entries that hinted at Thomas's deep bond with Rusty and his belief in the dog's spiritual connection to him. One journal entry from the day Thomas brought Baxter home stood out. November 2nd, 2010. "When I saw him at the shelter, I knew. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like looking into Rusty's eyes all over again. I didn't choose him, he chose me. I can't shake the feeling that he's here for a reason." Emily closed the journal, her hands trembling. The idea seemed absurd, and yet the evidence was there. Her father had believed that Baxter was more than just a dog. He believed Baxter was a part of something greater, a guardian sent to guide and protect him. Returning to the hospital, Emily found Baxter still at his post, his head resting against Thomas's hand. She knelt beside him, her heart heavy with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. "Baxter," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you really Rusty?" The dog lifted his head, meeting her gaze with an expression so profound it made her chest tighten. He leaned forward, resting his head against her shoulder, and for a moment, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of connection, one that defied explanation. As the day wore on, Thomas grew weaker, but his final words to Emily that evening were clear and filled with conviction. "He's your guardian now." The quiet hum of the hospital monitors filled the room as Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness. Emily sat at his bedside, her thoughts a tangled mess. The idea that Baxter could be more than just a loyal companion gnawed at her. Her father's words lingered. "He's your guardian now." Baxter remained steadfast, his head resting lightly on Thomas's frail hand. He had barely moved since their arrival, except to reposition himself when Thomas stirred. There was something undeniably unique about the dog's presence, a calming aura that seemed to fill the room, warding off the despair that threatened to overwhelm Emily. As dusk settled, a nurse entered the room, checking Thomas's vitals. She paused, glancing at Baxter with a gentle smile. "He hasn't left your father's side, has he?" Emily shook her head. "Not once. It's like he knows." The nurse nodded thoughtfully. Animals have a way of sensing things. They often know when someone is near the end. It's their way of comforting us. Emily hesitated, then decided to share her father's belief. "My dad, he thinks Baxter is connected to his old dog, Rusty, that somehow he came back to watch over him." The nurse's expression softened. "I've seen stranger things. The bond between a person and their pet is special, sometimes even unexplainable. Maybe your father isn't wrong." After the nurse left, Emily turned to Baxter. She knelt beside him, her fingers gently brushing through his fur. "What are you trying to tell us, boy?" she murmured. "Are you really here for him? For me?" Baxter's amber eyes met hers, and in that moment, Emily felt a wave of emotion crash over her. It was as if the dog could see straight into her soul, understanding every doubt and fear she harbored. He nuzzled her hand, his warmth grounding her amidst the uncertainty. That night, Emily couldn't bring herself to leave. She curled up in the chair by Thomas's bed, drifting into a restless sleep. In her dreams, she saw Rusty, not as the dog in the photograph, but as a golden silhouette standing in a sunlit meadow. Beside him stood Baxter, their forms blending into one as if they were the same soul in different lifetimes. A sense of peace washed over her, followed by a whisper that seemed to echo in her mind. "Trust him." Emily awoke with a start, her heart pounding. The room was quiet except for the soft breathing of Thomas and the steady presence of Baxter. She looked at the dog, her dream still vivid in her mind. "Rusty," she whispered, testing the name. Baxter perked up slightly, his ears twitching as if acknowledging her words. The following day, Thomas's condition worsened. The doctor gently explained that it was time to make him as comfortable as possible. Emily nodded, her chest tightening. She sat by her father, holding his hand, while Baxter remained at his side, a silent sentinel. As the hours passed, family and friends came to say their goodbyes. Some were startled to see the dog's unwavering vigil, but none questioned it. "He's part of the family," Emily explained more than once. Later that evening, as the room emptied, Thomas stirred weakly. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they were clear and filled with an unusual brightness. He looked at Emily, then at Baxter, and a faint smile crossed his lips. "Emily," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Remember, he's yours now. Take care of him, and he'll take care of you." Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "I promise, Dad." Thomas's gaze shifted to Baxter, his hand trembling as he reached to touch the dog's head. "Thank you for everything," he whispered. Baxter leaned into the touch, his tail wagging softly. It was a gesture filled with gratitude, as if he too understood the weight of the moment. As the night deepened, Thomas took his final breath. The room fell silent, the air heavy with loss. Emily buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. Baxter stayed by her side, his head resting on her lap, offering the silent comfort only he could provide. The days that followed were a blur. Emily found herself leaning on Baxter more than she ever thought possible. The dog was a constant source of strength, his presence a reminder of her father's final words. One afternoon, while sorting through her father's belongings, Emily came across a box labeled Rusty's Memories. Inside were collars, toys, and a scrapbook filled with photos and notes about her father's life with his first dog. Each page told a story of their adventures, their bond, and the unconditional love they shared. At the very back of the scrapbook, Emily found a handwritten note from her father. "If Rusty ever finds his way back to me, I'll know I've done something right in this life. And if he stays to watch over Emily when I'm gone, then I'll know she's in good hands." Emily clutched the note to her chest, her tears falling freely. She looked at Baxter, who was lying by her feet, his eyes watching her with quiet understanding. "You've been with us all along, haven't you?" she whispered. Baxter wagged his tail, and in that moment Emily felt a flicker of hope. Her father may have been gone, but his legacy, and his guardian, remained. The days following Thomas's passing were heavy with grief, but life slowly began to move forward. Emily took comfort in Baxter's unwavering presence. The dog had become her anchor, his quiet companionship a constant reminder of her father's love and the strange, almost supernatural connection that seemed to bind them all. However, questions lingered in Emily's mind. The note she found in her father's scrapbook was both comforting and unsettling. How could Thomas have known? Could there really be something extraordinary about Baxter? One afternoon, as Emily was cleaning out the attic, she came across an old trunk that had belonged to her grandmother. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, clearly untouched for years. Inside, she discovered a collection of journals, their leather covers cracked and worn with age. Curious, she flipped through them and found entries about Rusty. Her grandmother's handwriting revealed that Rusty wasn't just a family pet. He had been her father's constant companion through some of the most challenging times of his life, losing his own father, struggling through college, and finding his footing as a young adult. But there was one entry that caught Emily's attention. Rusty had an uncanny sense about people. He could sense danger before it happened, offer comfort without being called, and protect without hesitation. Some might call it instinct, but I always believed there was something more. Maybe he was more than just a dog. Maybe he was a guardian. The word guardian sent a chill down Emily's spine. It echoed her father's final words, and the nurse's observation about animals having an innate ability to sense things humans couldn't. She looked down at Baxter, who had followed her into the attic and was now lying at her feet. "What are you, boy?" she asked softly. Baxter's tail wagged, but his amber eyes seemed to hold a knowing glint, as if he understood the weight of her question. Later that week, Emily decided to visit the veterinary clinic where her father had first adopted Baxter. She wanted answers, even if she wasn't entirely sure what questions to ask. The clinic was small and cozy, with a friendly receptionist who remembered Baxter immediately. "Ah, yes, Baxter. Thomas came in almost every month to check on him. He loved this dog like family," the receptionist said with a warm smile. Emily hesitated before speaking. "Do you remember anything unusual about when my dad adopted him?" The receptionist furrowed her brow in thought. "I wasn't working here then, but Dr. Harper was. She might remember. Let me get her for you." A few moments later, an older woman with kind eyes and a white coat stepped into the lobby. "Emily, it's so nice to see you," Dr. Harper said. "I'm sorry about your father. He was a wonderful man." "Thank you," Emily replied. "I wanted to ask about Baxter. Is there anything you can tell me about when my dad adopted him?" Dr. Harper's expression softened. "I do remember that day. Baxter was a stray when he was brought in, thin, scared, but incredibly gentle. He bonded with your dad almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting for him." "Waiting for him," Emily echoed. "Yes," Dr. Harper said, nodding. "I remember joking with your dad about it, saying that Baxter must have known he'd come for him. It was remarkable, really. Most strays are wary of strangers, but Baxter walked right up to your dad and leaned against him, as if they were already old friends." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. "Do you think it's possible he knew my dad somehow? Like, maybe they'd crossed paths before?" Dr. Harper hesitated, then said, "I've seen a lot in my years as a vet. Animals have ways of connecting with people that we don't fully understand. I can't explain it, but Baxter and your father had a bond that was undeniable." That evening, Emily sat on her couch, the journals, her father's scrapbook, and Dr. Harper's words swirling in her mind. Baxter lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. "Maybe you are more than just a dog," she said aloud. "But why? Why are you here, and why now?" Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from an old family friend, Mrs. Hargrove, who had known her father since childhood. "Emily, I've been thinking about Thomas and Rusty. If you're free, I'd love to share some stories with you." Emily replied quickly, setting up a time to visit. She had a feeling Mrs. Hargrove might have answers to the questions that were beginning to consume her. When Emily arrived at Mrs. Hargrove's house the next day, the elderly woman greeted her warmly. "Come in, dear. I've been meaning to talk to you ever since the funeral." Emily sat down, and Mrs. Hargrove wasted no time diving into her memories. "Thomas and Rusty had a bond like no other. That dog was more than a pet, he was his protector. There was this one time when Thomas was about your age that Rusty saved him from a terrible accident. It was almost as if he knew what was going to happen before it did." "What kind of accident?" Emily asked. Her curiosity piqued. Mrs. Hargrove leaned in, her voice lowering. "Thomas was working late one night, and Rusty wouldn't stop barking. He dragged him out of the house, and moments later the roof collapsed. If Rusty hadn't acted, Thomas wouldn't have survived." Emily sat back, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they painted was unlike anything she had ever imagined. Could it be that Baxter was here, not just for her father, but for her as well? If so, what was he protecting her from? The more Emily unraveled about her father, Rusty and now Baxter, the deeper her emotional turmoil became. Was this merely coincidence, or was there something truly extraordinary at play? She couldn't shake the feeling that Baxter's arrival into their lives, coupled with her father's final words, was no accident. One evening, as the sun set and the house was bathed in a golden glow, Emily sat on the porch with Baxter by her side. The weight of her discoveries pressed heavily on her chest. She stared at the horizon, lost in thought, when her phone buzzed with a message from Michael, her fiancé. "How are you holding up?" Emily hesitated before responding. She loved Michael dearly, but how could she explain everything she had uncovered? It sounded absurd, even to her. Instead, she replied with a simple, "I'm okay. Just a lot on my mind." Moments later, the phone rang. "Emily," Michael's voice was soft and understanding. "I know you're not okay. Please talk to me." Tears welled in her eyes as she finally broke down. "Michael, it's Baxter. He's not just a dog. There's something more. I don't know how to explain it, but I think he's protecting me from what I don't know." Michael was silent for a moment, then asked gently, "What makes you think that?" Emily recounted everything: her father's scrapbook, the journals, Dr. Harper's words, and Mrs. Hargrove's story. By the end, her voice was trembling. "I sound crazy, don't I?" Michael's reply surprised her. "No, you don't. Emily, animals have a way of sensing things we can't. So I've read stories about dogs detecting illnesses, warning about disasters. Maybe Baxter is here for a reason. But the question is, what do you want to do about it?" Emily glanced down at Baxter, who was watching her intently, as if understanding every word. "I want answers," she whispered. "I need to know why he's here." The following morning, Emily decided to act. If Baxter truly had some connection to her father, perhaps revisiting the places they shared would yield more clues. She packed a bag, grabbed Baxter's leash, and set out to her father's favorite hiking trail, a secluded path winding through the woods that Thomas often visited for peace and reflection. As they walked, the memories came flooding back. She could almost see her father ahead of her, his steady stride and warm smile lighting up the path. Baxter trotted alongside her, his demeanor unusually alert. Every so often, he would stop, sniff the air, and glance back at Emily, as if checking to ensure she was okay. Halfway through the trail, Baxter suddenly froze. His ears perked, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Baxter turned sharply, pulling on the leash, leading Emily off the path and into the dense woods. Her pulse quickened as branches snapped underfoot. "Baxter, slow down," she called, struggling to keep up. Finally, they reached a small clearing. In the center was an old oak tree, its massive trunk gnarled and weathered with age. Emily recognized it immediately. It was the spot where her father often brought her as a child, a place he called his sanctuary. Baxter sat at the base of the tree, his tail wagging gently. He pawed at the ground, whining softly, as if urging her to look closer. Emily knelt and began to clear away the leaves and dirt. To her astonishment, she uncovered a small wooden box, weathered but intact. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a collection of items: a faded photograph of her father with Rusty, a handwritten letter, and a tarnished locket. She unfolded the letter, her breath catching as she recognized her father's handwriting. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, it means Baxter has brought you here. I don't know how to explain it, but our family has always had a bond with these extraordinary dogs. Rusty saved my life countless times, and now Baxter is here for you. Trust him. He will guide you when you need it most, just as Rusty guided me. Love always, Dad." Emily clutched the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She looked at Baxter, who was now sitting quietly, his amber eyes filled with what could only be described as understanding. "You really are more than just a dog," she whispered. On the way back home, Emily's mind raced. The letter confirmed what she had suspected, but it also raised new questions. What did her father mean by guiding her when she needed it most? What could Baxter possibly know about her future that she didn't? As they arrived home, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just going to let this mystery linger. She would dig deeper, uncover every secret her father had kept, and finally understand the truth about Baxter's role in her life. But even as she resolved to push forward, a flicker of fear crept into her heart. If Baxter was here to protect her, what exactly was he protecting her from? The days after discovering her father's letter at the oak tree were filled with a mix of hope and unease for Emily. Baxter's presence, once a simple comfort, now carried an undeniable weight. Each time his ears twitched or he looked intently at a seemingly empty corner of the room, she couldn't help but wonder, what was he sensing? Emily decided to focus on her father's belongings again, hoping they might reveal more about the bond between Rusty and him. She spent hours poring over photo albums, journals, and memorabilia stored in the attic. Among the items, she found another peculiar object, a rusted compass tucked inside a velvet pouch, with the initials TM engraved on the back. The compass didn't seem remarkable at first, but as Emily examined it closely, she noticed a faint inscription along its edge. Squinting to read the faded words, she deciphered, "Always find your way home." That night, Emily placed the compass on her nightstand, and lay in bed, restless. Baxter curled up on the floor beside her as usual, but his ears perked up and his gaze remained fixed on the window. "What is it, boy?" Emily asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Baxter didn't respond in his usual way, with a wag of his tail or a reassuring glance. Instead, he stood up, padded to the window, and let out a low growl. Emily sat up, her heart pounding. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it outside into the dark yard. Nothing. Just the swaying trees and the faint glow of the streetlight. "You're just spooked, Baxter," Emily said, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was trying to reassure him or herself. She closed the blinds and returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Emily decided to share what she had found with Michael. She invited him over, along with Mrs. Hargrove, hoping that their perspectives might shed light on the growing mystery. "I found this compass in my dad's things," Emily explained as they gathered around the kitchen table. She handed it to Michael, who turned it over in his hands, his brow furrowing. "The inscription feels like a message, but I don't know what it's pointing to, if it's even pointing to anything." Mrs. Hargrove peered at the compass and gasped. "I remember that compass. Your father carried it everywhere after Rusty passed. He used to say it reminded him that no matter how lost he felt, he could always find his way back." Emily's heart ached at the thought. "Back to what, though?" she asked, more to herself than to anyone else. Michael's expression turned thoughtful. "Do you think it could be a literal message? Like, maybe there's another place you need to find?" "That's exactly what I've been wondering," Emily said. "But where do I even start?" "Mrs." Hargrove reached out and placed a comforting hand on Emily's. "Sometimes the answers find you, dear. Just like Baxter brought you to that letter. Trust him." Later that day, Emily decided to test the compass, taking Baxter for a walk to the woods where she'd found the letter. She held the compass in her hand, watching as the needle swung erratically before finally settling in one direction. "Let's see where it leads," she murmured to Baxter, who wagged his tail as if in agreement. They followed the compass deeper into the forest, the air growing cooler and the trees denser with each step. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being guided, not just by the compass but by something greater. After nearly an hour of walking, they reached a small clearing she'd never seen before. At its center stood a dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls weathered by time. Baxter barked once, sharply, then sprinted ahead, his nose to the ground. "Baxter, wait!" Emily called, her voice echoing in the stillness. She approached the cabin cautiously, the compass still clutched in her hand. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a single, dusty room. Inside was sparse: a wooden table, an old rocking chair, and a stack of yellowed papers. Baxter was sniffing near the fireplace, his tail wagging furiously. Emily knelt beside him and found a small, locked chest hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. The chest was ornate, with intricate carvings of leaves and vines, and the initials T.M. etched onto the lid. "This was my dad's," Emily whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Back home, Emily used a set of old keys she'd found among her father's belongings to open the chest. Inside were more photographs, letters, and a small leather-bound journal. The first entry stopped her cold. "If anything happens to me, trust Baxter. He's here for you, Emily, just as Rusty was there for me. Some things can't be explained, only felt. You'll understand when the time comes." The rest of the journal detailed her father's life after Rusty's passing, how he'd struggled with grief, found solace in nature, and eventually adopted Baxter. But there were also entries about strange occurrences, dreams he couldn't explain, feelings of being watched, and moments where Baxter seemed to intervene at just the right time. As Emily closed the journal, a knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Michael, his expression tense. "Emily, I just got a call from Mrs. Hargrove. She said she remembered something important about your dad and Rusty." Emily's pulse quickened. "What did she say?" Michael hesitated. "She didn't want to tell me over the phone. She said it was something you needed to hear in person." Baxter barked softly, as if urging them to go. Emily grabbed her coat and the journal, her heart pounding as she prepared to uncover yet another layer of the mystery. Emily and Michael arrived at Mrs. Hargrove's home just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. Baxter, as usual, stayed close to Emily's side, his movements calm yet deliberate, as if he too sensed the weight of the moment. Mrs. Hargrove greeted them at the door with a nervous smile. Her usually warm demeanor was tinged with unease, and she ushered them into her living room without delay. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a comforting blend that contrasted sharply with the tension in the air. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Hargrove began, her hands trembling slightly as she motioned for them to sit. "I've been piecing things together ever since you mentioned the compass and the journal. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have shared years ago." Emily leaned forward, clutching the journal in her lap. "What is it?" Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, her eyes flitting toward Baxter, who had settled at Emily's feet but kept his sharp gaze fixed on her. "It's about Rusty and your father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And why your father was so insistent on keeping you and Baxter close." She began to tell them a story, one that unfolded like a forgotten memory brought back to life. Years ago, when Emily's father first adopted Rusty, he had confided in Mrs. Hargrove about a strange experience he couldn't explain. Rusty had shown an uncanny ability to sense danger, often acting as though he knew what was coming before anyone else did. "There was an incident," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice trembling. "Your father was hiking alone in the woods, and Rusty stopped him from crossing a river. The next day, that very spot was washed away in a flood. He said Rusty saved his life." Emily nodded, her heart heavy with the echoes of her father's words in the journal. "That sounds like Baxter," she murmured. "He always knows when something's wrong." Mrs. Hargrove continued, her gaze distant as though reliving the past. "Your father became convinced that Rusty wasn't just a dog, but something more, a guardian, a protector. And when Rusty passed, he believed that bond would carry on to the next dog he adopted." Emily glanced at Baxter, who was watching Mrs. Hargrove with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. "Do you think that's why my dad chose Baxter?" she asked. Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, then nodded. "I believe so. He always said he felt a connection with Baxter the moment he saw him, like Rusty had somehow led him to that shelter, to that exact moment." Michael, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "But why all the secrecy? Why didn't he just tell Emily about this?" "Because he didn't want to frighten her," Mrs. Hargrove replied. "He was worried it would sound unbelievable. But more than that, he didn't fully understand it himself." Emily's mind raced as she processed the revelation. Her father's journal, the compass, the letter by the oak tree, it all pointed to a bond that went beyond what she could comprehend. Yet, one question loomed larger than the rest. "Why now?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why is this all happening now, when my dad is gone?" Mrs. Hargrove's expression darkened. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know one thing. Baxter is trying to protect you, just like Rusty protected your father. Whatever is happening, you need to trust him." As they left Mrs. Hargrove's house, the weight of her words lingered in the air. Emily walked ahead, lost in thought, while Michael stayed back with Baxter, who seemed unusually restless. "Do you think it's true?" Michael asked, his voice low. "About Baxter being some kind of guardian?" Emily paused, glancing back at them. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I've felt it too, the way he always seems to know what I need before I do. It's like he's connected to something I can't see." They reached the car, and Baxter hesitated before jumping in, his ears twitching as though catching a sound they couldn't hear. Emily noticed and frowned. "What is it, boy?" Baxter let out a low whine, his eyes darting toward the woods in the distance. Emily followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. Still, a sense of unease settled over her, as though something unseen was watching them. Back at the house, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Baxter was trying to warn her. She decided to revisit her father's journal, hoping it might hold more clues. Michael stayed with her, sorting through the photographs and letters they had found in the chest. "Here," he said, holding up a photo of her father and Rusty by the oak tree. "Look at this." Emily took the photo and examined it closely. Her father was holding the same compass she had found, and Rusty was sitting at his feet, staring directly at the camera with an expression that was almost knowing. Suddenly, Baxter barked, startling them both. He was standing at the door, his tail stiff, his body tense. Emily and Michael exchanged a worried glance before rushing to see what had caught his attention. The porch light flickered as they stepped outside, and a cold wind swept through the yard. Baxter growled low in his throat, his eyes fixed on the woods. Emily's heart raced as she followed his gaze, seeing nothing but shadows. "What's out there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Baxter barked again, then looked up at her with an urgency she couldn't ignore. It was clear, whatever was coming, they weren't safe. The night settled heavily over Emily's home, the air thick with an almost tangible unease. Inside, the faint ticking of the clock filled the silence as Emily sat on the living room floor, surrounded by her father's journal, old photographs, and scattered notes. Baxter lay beside her, his head resting on her lap, but his ears twitched at every sound, his body rigid with tension. His behavior had grown increasingly protective, and Emily couldn't ignore the sense that something significant was about to happen. Michael sat across from her, studying the map they'd found in one of the envelopes. "This place," he said, pointing to a marked location deep within the woods. "Your dad mentioned it in his journal. It's where he said Rusty saved him." Emily traced the lines of the map with her finger. He wrote about feeling something there, something he couldn't explain. It was like Rusty was guiding him toward or away from something. Baxter let out a low growl, drawing their attention. He stood abruptly, his gaze fixed on the front door. Emily followed his line of sight, her pulse quickening. "What is it, boy?" The room seemed to hold its breath as Baxter moved toward the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He barked once, sharp and commanding, then looked back at Emily as if urging her to follow. Emily exchanged a glance with Michael, who nodded. "Let's see what's going on." Grabbing a flashlight, they stepped out onto the porch. The air was colder than it should have been for the season, and the trees swayed eerily in the windless night. Baxter stood at the edge of the porch, his body taut, every muscle coiled as though ready to spring into action. "What is it, Baxter?" Emily whispered. The dog growled, his eyes fixed on the woods. Emily's gaze followed his, but the darkness concealed whatever had captured his attention. She turned to Michael. "Do you think we should check it out?" Michael hesitated, but then nodded. "If Baxter thinks there's something out there, we need to trust him." They grabbed their jackets and followed Baxter as he led them toward the woods. His steps were confident and deliberate, as though he knew exactly where he was going. Emily's grip tightened on the flashlight as they ventured deeper into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness, but revealing little. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor. Baxter suddenly stopped, his ears perked, and let out a low growl. Emily froze, her heart pounding. "What is it, boy?" Before Michael could respond, a rustling sound came from the bushes ahead. Baxter lunged forward, barking furiously, his body blocking Emily as if shielding her from danger. Emily shone the flashlight toward the noise, and for a moment, she thought she saw a pair of glowing eyes reflecting back at her. "What was that?" she gasped, gripping Michael's arm. "I don't know," Michael said, his voice tense, "but we need to keep moving." Baxter didn't wait for their decision. He began walking again, his growls low but persistent, guiding them further into the woods. The rustling followed them, always just out of sight, heightening their unease. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood an old oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like twisted fingers. Emily immediately recognized it from the photographs and her father's journal. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is where my dad said Rusty saved him." Baxter circled the base of the tree, his nose to the ground, sniffing furiously. Emily knelt beside him, her hand brushing against something in the dirt. She shone the flashlight down and gasped. It was the compass, the same compass her father had mentioned, half buried in the soil, its surface tarnished with age. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. "He must have left it here." Michael crouched beside her, studying the ground. "Do you think he was trying to leave us a message?" Baxter barked sharply, interrupting their thoughts. He stood rigid, his gaze fixed on the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Emily followed his line of sight, her stomach twisting with dread as the rustling grew louder, closer. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees. It was large and shadowy, its movements slow and deliberate. Emily's flashlight flickered as she pointed it toward the figure, revealing the outline of a wolf. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, and it stood motionless, watching them. "Stay behind me," Michael said, stepping in front of Emily. Baxter positioned himself between them and the wolf, his body low, teeth bared, growling fiercely. The wolf didn't move but continued to stare, its presence unsettling and unnatural. Emily's mind raced. This wasn't just a wild animal. There was something otherworldly about it. She clutched the compass tightly, feeling its weight in her hand as though it were a tether to her father and Rusty. "What do we do?" she whispered. Michael didn't respond. His focus was entirely on the wolf, whose gaze now shifted to Baxter. The two animals seemed locked in a silent standoff, the air crackling with tension. Then, without warning, the wolf let out a low growl and took a step forward. Baxter barked furiously, his entire body vibrating with the intensity of his warning. Emily felt a surge of fear, but also an unshakable sense of trust in Baxter. He wasn't just protecting her, he was facing something far beyond what any ordinary dog could comprehend. The wolf paused, its head tilting as if considering its next move. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the echo of its growl behind. Baxter relaxed slightly but didn't let his guard down. Emily knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice shaking. Michael helped her to her feet, his face pale but resolute. "We need to get back. Whatever that was, it's not over." As they turned to leave, Emily glanced back at the oak tree, the compass clutched tightly in her hand. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Trust Baxter. He'll guide you when the time comes." And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that the time had come. Back at the house, the air was charged with an unsettling tension. Emily sat at the dining table, the compass placed carefully in front of her. Its worn metal surface caught the light, and she could almost imagine her father holding it during his final days. Baxter lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes were fixed on the compass, as if it held answers only he could understand. Michael paced the room, his face lined with worry. "Emily, that wolf, it wasn't normal. There's something bigger happening here." Emily nodded, her fingers brushing against the compass. "My dad always believed Rusty saved him from something he couldn't explain. Maybe Baxter's trying to do the same for me." The room fell silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock. Outside, the wind howled, and the branches of the old oak tree outside the window tapped against the glass. Baxter perked up, his ears twitching, and let out a low growl. Emily looked at Michael, her heart pounding. "He senses something." Michael grabbed the flashlight and his coat. "If Baxter thinks there's a reason to check, we need to follow him." The three of them ventured outside into the cold, dark night. Baxter led the way, his steps deliberate and purposeful. The compass hung around Emily's neck, swaying with each step as though it, when too, was being drawn to their destination. They reached the clearing where the oak tree stood, its twisted branches casting long shadows in the moonlight. The air felt heavier here, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "What now?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Emily could respond, Baxter barked sharply, startling them both. He began digging at the base of the tree, his powerful paws sending dirt flying. Emily rushed to his side, kneeling beside him. "Baxter, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. Beneath the disturbed soil, something metallic glinted in the moonlight. Emily reached into the hole and pulled out an old, rusted box. It was heavy, its surface covered in dirt and moss. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were a collection of weathered papers, a photograph, and a small notebook. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the photo. Her father, holding Rusty, standing in front of the very oak tree where they now stood. Michael knelt beside her, shining the flashlight on the notebook. "What is this?" Emily flipped through the pages, her father's handwriting filling each one. The entries were fragmented, but the message was clear. He had been afraid of something. He wrote about strange occurrences, an ever-present feeling of being watched, and Rusty's unwavering determination to protect him. One entry caught Emily's eye. "If anything happens to me, trust Rusty. He knows the truth." Her grip on the notebook tightened as she read the final lines aloud. "There's something in the woods, something ancient. It's not just a wolf, it's something more. Rusty has always known." The words hung heavy in the air as the wind picked up, rustling the leaves around them. Baxter growled low and deep, his body rigid. Emily turned to Michael, fear etched on her face. "He was trying to warn me," she whispered. "All these years, he knew something was out here." Michael nodded, his jaw tight. And now Baxter's carrying on where Rusty left off. Suddenly, a distant howl pierced the night, long and mournful. Emily's heart raced as the sound echoed through the forest. Baxter stood, his body trembling with tension, and let out a sharp bark. "We're not alone," Michael said, gripping Emily's arm. The howl grew louder, closer, and was joined by others. Emily's mind raced as she tried to piece everything together. "It's not just one wolf," she said, her voice breaking. "It's a pack," Baxter barked again, his stance protective as shadows began to move at the edge of the clearing. Michael shone the flashlight toward the movement, revealing the glint of yellow eyes staring back at them. There were at least 3 wolves, their forms blending seamlessly with the darkness. Emily clutched the compass tightly, her father's final words echoing in her mind. "Trust Baxter." The lead wolf stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. Baxter growled, baring his teeth, and stepped in front of Emily, his stance unwavering. The air was thick with tension, and Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest. "What do we do?" Michael asked, his voice barely audible. Emily didn't answer. Instead, she knelt beside Baxter, placing her hand on his back. "We trust him." The lead wolf snarled, its growl reverberating through the clearing. Baxter responded with a bark so fierce it seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. The 2 animals locked eyes, and Emily felt a strange energy ripple through the air, as though the forest itself was alive and watching. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, the wolves retreated into the shadows, their glowing eyes disappearing one by one. Emily let out a shaky breath, her hand still on Baxter's back. "He did it," Michael said, his voice filled with awe. "He protected us." Baxter turned to Emily, his eyes meeting hers. In that moment, she felt an unbreakable bond between them, one that transcended time and space. Her father's words had been right. Baxter knew the truth, and he had guided her through the danger. As the forest fell silent once more, Emily stood, the compass still clutched in her hand. "This isn't over," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever my father discovered, it's still out there. And Baxter and I are going to find out what it is." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll do it together." With Baxter leading the way, they began their journey back to the house, knowing that the answers they sought were closer than ever, and that the most critical confrontation was yet to come. The walk back to the house was shrouded in a tense silence. Emily's mind raced with questions, her father's words echoing alongside the haunting events of the night. Michael walked beside her, his flashlight sweeping the darkened forest, while Baxter stayed close, his eyes darting toward every shadow. The unearthed notebook weighed heavily in Emily's hands, its revelations gnawing at her. Rusty had protected her father against an ancient force, and now it seemed that Baxter was continuing that mission. But why? What was the true nature of the danger that lingered in these woods? As they neared the edge of the property, the familiar sight of the house came into view. Yet instead of relief, a chill ran down Emily's spine. The front door was ajar, swinging lightly in the breeze. Michael stopped abruptly. "Did you leave the door open?" Emily shook her head. "No, I locked it before we left." Baxter let out a low growl, his fur bristling as he stepped in front of them. Michael tightened his grip on the flashlight, motioning for Emily to stay back. "Wait here," he whispered, but Emily shook her head firmly. "No, we do this together." They approached the house cautiously, Baxter leading the way. The interior was dark, save for the faint glow of the kitchen light spilling down the hallway. As they stepped inside, the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. "Stay close," Michael murmured, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded, clutching the notebook tightly. Baxter sniffed the air, his movements slow and deliberate. He growled again, his body tense, and led them toward the living room. The compass around Emily's neck began to sway unnaturally, as though drawn by an invisible force. "What's happening?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Michael held up the flashlight, its beam revealing the living room in disarray. Furniture was overturned, and the shattered remnants of the family photo frames littered the floor. In the center of the room, the compass swung violently, pulling against the chain as if trying to break free. Baxter barked sharply, his gaze fixed on a corner of the room where the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. Emily's breath caught as the air grew colder, her breath visible in the dim light. Suddenly, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the room, not from Baxter, but from the shadows themselves. Michael raised the flashlight, and the beam fell upon a pair of glowing eyes. A massive, spectral wolf emerged, its translucent form shimmering with an eerie light. Its presence was both majestic and terrifying, its gaze locked on Emily. Michael stepped back instinctively. "What is that?" Emily's hands trembled as she held the notebook tighter. "I think it's what my father was warning about." The spectral wolf snarled, its form rippling as it took a step closer. Baxter barked fiercely, positioning himself between Emily and the creature. Despite the size difference, Baxter held his ground, his growls unwavering. Emily felt a surge of courage as she looked at Baxter. Her father's words echoed in her mind, "Trust him." She knelt beside her loyal companion, placing a hand on his back. "We're in this together," she whispered. The compass grew hotter against her chest, its pull almost magnetic. Emily reached for it, unhooking it from her neck. As soon as it left her grasp, it hovered in midair, spinning wildly before pointing directly at the spectral wolf. The creature let out a deafening howl, and the room seemed to tremble. The energy around them intensified, the walls vibrating as if the house itself were reacting to the confrontation. Emily opened the notebook, frantically flipping through the pages. Her father had mentioned something about the compass being more than a keepsake. It was a key, a tool meant to seal whatever force had been threatening their family for generations. "Michael," she called out, "I think I know what to do." Michael turned to her, his face pale. "What do you need?" "I need to get the compass into the light," Emily said, her voice firm despite her fear. "It's the only way to banish it." The spectral wolf lunged forward, its jaws snapping, but Baxter intercepted it, leaping into its path. The two collided, a flash of light erupting from the impact. Baxter yelped but didn't back down, his determination unwavering. Emily ran toward the kitchen, where the light was brightest. The compass followed her, glowing brighter with each step. Michael grabbed a fallen chair, swinging it at the spectral wolf to buy her more time. Reaching the kitchen, Emily held the compass aloft, its glow illuminating the room. "Come on!" she shouted, her voice trembling. "Let's end this." The spectral wolf turned its gaze toward her, its eyes blazing with fury. It charged, but just as it reached the threshold of the kitchen, the compass emitted a blinding light. The creature howled in agony, its form dissolving into wisps of smoke. The house fell silent. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. Baxter limped toward Emily, his tail wagging weakly. Emily knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face as she hugged him tightly. "You did it, Baxter. You saved us." Michael joined them, his hand on Emily's shoulder. "That was incredible. I've never seen anything like it." Emily nodded, her heart still racing. "Neither have I. But I think we've finally put my father's fears, and whatever that was, to rest." Together they stood in the quiet kitchen, the compass now cool in Emily's hand. Though the danger had passed, they knew this was just the beginning of a deeper mystery. And with Baxter by her side, Emily was ready to face whatever came next. The house was quiet now, its shadows no longer shifting with malevolence, but still cloaked in an uneasy silence. Emily sat on the kitchen floor with Baxter curled against her, his breathing heavy but steady. The once threatening compass lay in her palm. Its glow faded, leaving only a faint warmth. Michael knelt beside her, his eyes scanning the room for any lingering danger. "Do you think it's really gone?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded slowly. "I think so," she said, though her voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "The compass, whatever it did, I think it worked. But it's not just about the wolf. There's something more here, something my father never fully explained." Baxter shifted, letting out a low whine as he licked her hand. Emily looked down at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and sorrow. His unwavering courage had saved them, and she could see the toll it had taken on his aging body. His fur was matted, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. "You were so brave," Emily whispered, stroking his head. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Michael glanced toward the living room, where the damage from the spectral encounter was still evident. "We should clean this up," he said. "But first, I think we need to figure out what all of this means. That compass, it's not just a keepsake." Emily nodded, her fingers brushing over the intricate carvings on the compass. "It belonged to my dad. He always said it was passed down through the family, but I never thought it was anything more than a sentimental heirloom. Now I see it's something much bigger." Michael leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Do you think your father knew this would happen? That's why he wrote those notes?" Emily frowned, flipping through the notebook once more. Her father's meticulous handwriting filled the pages, detailing stories of strange encounters, warnings, and cryptic references to the compass's power. She stopped on one page where he had written, "The compass is the key to protecting the bond." "The bond," Emily murmured, her brow furrowing. "He always talked about the bond between him and Rusty, his old dog. He said it was unbreakable, that it went beyond what most people could understand." Michael tilted his head. "You think that's what he meant? That this bond is connected to the compass somehow?" Emily looked at Baxter, who was now resting his head on her lap. "I think it's more than that. Baxter, he's not just a loyal dog, he's a protector, just like Rusty was for my dad. They're part of this bond, this force that keeps whatever that thing was from taking hold." Michael crouched beside her, his face serious. "So, Baxter isn't just protecting you because he loves you, he's protecting something bigger." Emily's chest tightened at the thought. "But what happens when he can't anymore? He's getting older, Michael. Tonight took so much out of him." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out. Together. And you've got your father's notes to guide you. You're not alone in this." Emily nodded, though the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her. She flipped to the last page of the notebook and found a passage written in bold letters. "When the time comes, trust the compass and the bond. It will guide you to the truth." Before she could ponder its meaning further, Baxter suddenly lifted his head, his ears perked. He let out a soft bark, his eyes focused on the doorway leading to the backyard. Emily and Michael exchanged a glance, and without hesitation, they followed his lead. Stepping outside, the cool night air greeted them, the sky now clear and filled with stars. Baxter limped forward, his nose to the ground as he led them toward the edge of the woods. Emily's heart raced, unsure of what they might find. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, following him as he stopped near an old gnarled tree. Its roots stretched out like claws, gripping the earth. Baxter sniffed around the base of the tree, then pawed at the ground. Emily crouched beside him, brushing aside leaves and dirt. Her fingers hit something solid, a small rusted metal box. Michael knelt to help her pry it open. Inside, they found a folded piece of parchment and an old photograph. The photograph showed her father as a young man, standing proudly with Rusty by his side. The parchment was covered in faded writing, but one line stood out clearly: "The bond must continue. When the protector grows weak, the compass will choose the next." Emily's breath hitched as she read the words. "The next? What does that mean?" Michael looked at her with a mix of awe and concern. "I think it means that Baxter isn't the last. This bond is something that goes beyond a single dog or person. It's a legacy." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she looked at Baxter, who gazed back at her with unwavering trust. "So, this isn't the end. It's just another chapter." Michael nodded. "And you're part of it now, just like your dad was." As they carried the box back to the house, Emily felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. The mystery was far from solved, but she wasn't afraid. With Baxter by her side and the compass guiding her, she knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. The first rays of dawn seeped through the curtains as Emily sat in her armchair, cradling the compass in her hands. Baxter lay at her feet, his breathing slow and steady, a gentle reminder of his unyielding loyalty. The house was calm now, its air lighter, as though the secrets it had harbored were finally beginning to dissipate. Michael brought her a cup of tea, placing it on the table beside her. "It's been a long night," he said softly, sitting down across from her. "But you did it, Emily. You found the truth." She nodded, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the compass. "Not all of it," she replied, "but I know now that this is just the beginning. My dad, he left this for a reason. He wanted me to understand the bond, to carry it forward." Her gaze fell to Baxter, whose tail gave a faint wag at the sound of her voice. Tears welled in her eyes. He's been my protector all these years, my constant companion, and now I see how much more he is. He's part of something bigger, something I barely understand. Michael leaned forward, his voice gentle. He's not just protecting you, Emily. He's showing you the way, and when the time comes, you'll know what to do. Emily nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. She reached for her father's notebook, flipping through the pages one last time. The final words jumped out at her again. Trust the bond. It will guide you. Taking a deep breath, she closed the notebook and set it aside. I'll trust it, she said firmly, for Baxter, for my dad, and for whatever comes next. As the sun climbed higher, casting its warm glow over the room, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The challenges were far from over, but she knew she wasn't facing them alone. She knelt beside Baxter, her hands gently stroking his fur. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. Baxter let out a soft whine, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of understanding that words couldn't capture. Emily looked up at Michael, her determination renewed. We'll figure this out. Together. Michael smiled, his confidence in her unwavering. I know we will. As the day unfolded, Emily began making plans, sorting through her father's notes and organizing the artifacts she had uncovered. She felt ready to take the next steps, no matter how uncertain the path ahead might be. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own experiences with the incredible bond between humans and animals, or let us know what you think about the mysteries Emily uncovered. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and inspiring stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for being part of this journey. We can't wait to see you in our next video, where more tales of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals await.